In this lesson, we'll use a direct painting method to create a portrait in oils on gessoed panel. The first thing we need to do is create a drawing on our prepared panel. In this case, I've prepared the panel with a layer of blue. There's a reason for this, and I'll get into that in just a moment. We can use a variety of methods to get our drawing onto the surface. For this example, I'm going to use a Graphite Transfer. So we'll just apply a soft graphite to the back of the photo reference. In this case, I'm using a 6B pencil. Once we've covered the entire back portion of our photo reference, we can lay it over the top of our prepared panel and position it in place. Then, using a couple of strips of masking tape, we can tape it down so it doesn't move. Now, of course, you can use a variety of different methods to get a contour line drawing onto the surface. You can freehand the drawing if you like. You can use a grid technique if you want a little bit more accuracy. But if you want the utmost accuracy, a Graphite Transfer is a good way to go. Then we can use a sharp, harder pencil, in this case an H pencil, to trace over all of the contour lines, concentrating on the shapes of value. Once we've done that, we can remove the photo reference, and now we see that we have a contour line drawing in place, and we can begin the painting process. Since the focal point in this painting will be the eyes, we'll spend the most time in this area and around these areas, and we'll start with an application using a touch of yellow ochre and titanium white, just filling in the white areas. Over the top, we can start adding some of the shadows. For this, we'll use a mixture of Prussian blue with a touch of burnt umber mixed in to create a more natural looking gray. We'll progressively get darker and progressively build up the contrast in this location. Now, at the beginning, I mentioned that we're working on a blue surface, and there's a reason for that. That reason is twofold. First of all, we want to create with a tonal value on the surface. So we don't want to really work on just a white surface. We want to have some value in place so that we can make comparisons with the values that we add throughout the painting. But also, this painting is a painting of a homeless person, and it's not the happiest of portraits. So I want to make sure that that sadness is conveyed in the painting. Some of these blue undertones will inherently show through the painting and help to create more natural looking shadows, but it will also help convey that feeling of sadness that we associate with the color blue. Now, as you've noticed, I've started to add some of the colors in the pupils and the iris. We've started with an application of Prussian blue with just a bit of burnt umber to darken it down. Then, using a mixture of Prussian blue and burnt umber, just a little bit heavier with the burnt umber, we've developed the pupil. So no black is used here, just a mixture of the dark blue and the dark brown. Then around the iris, we can add a bit of titanium white to slightly lighten it up, and then we'll continue to push the contrast in this section by continuing to add darker versions of the color mixed with Prussian blue and burnt umber, and lighter versions of the color mixed with a bit of titanium white. Since we're working with oil paints, we can gradually adjust these values and colors with each additional layer that we add. And as we go, our brushstrokes will slowly begin to disappear. Since we're working on a smooth surface, the brushstrokes will be very evident in the early stages when we first apply the paint. Now we'll simply continue the process of pushing the contrast in value. We'll add a bit of a lighter version in the areas of the white portions of the eyes. And we can blend transitions as well, going over the top of these applications with a brush without any paint on it. Then we can start to push the darker values. Again, this is a process of just pushing and pulling the dark and light values until we arrive at a value that's accurate. Now we're going back in with a darker version. Again, this is a mixture of Prussian blue and burnt umber. And then again, we can blend these transitions with the brush. Now we'll add just a touch of color. Using just a bit of alizarin crimson, we'll add just a pinkish tone in the left portion of the eye. And with a little bit more yellow ochre mixed in, we can add a little bit more of a warmer tone on the side that's closest to the light source. Now we're ready to add those strong highlights. Using titanium white, we'll go in and add a couple of highlights to both portions of the eyes. These highlights overlap the pupil and the iris slightly. We want these highlights to be strong, but if you find that later in the painting process you need to go back and strengthen them up, you can always do that. Using a bit of alizarin crimson with just a touch of burnt umber, we can add the tear ducts. Then once we've got our base color in place, we can go back and make adjustments to the value and the contrast. In this case, I'm adding a little bit of a darker version of the alizarin crimson. Again, we're making these colors darker by mixing Prussian blue and burnt umber with them instead of black. Using our darker mixture, this time a little bit more dominated with the Prussian blue, we'll go ahead and outline the upper portion of the eyes, and then just outside of that, the lower portion of the eyelid we'll address with a darker version of our alizarin crimson. So you can see it has a little bit of a purpley undertone, which brings us to mixing skin tones, because from here on out we're going to be developing the skin tones in the painting. Now, in most circumstances, we can mix a skin tone using a combination of red, yellow, brown, and white, and use a little bit of blue to create the shadows. I like to say red, yellow, brown, and white. That's how you make your skin tone right. But of course, there's a caveat to that because we also have to sometimes add a little bit of blues or purples or even some greens to create more natural looking shadows. But of course, blue and yellow make green, and blue and red, of course, make purple. So these are our basic colors that we're going to be dealing with. Now, of course, in the shadowed areas for this particular painting, we want to keep them very cool. Again, we want to create an element of sadness or a feeling of sadness in the portrait. So for this particular portrait in the shadowed areas, we're going to be using a cooler red, a more natural earthier yellow, and then a cool dark blue. So we'll be using alizarin crimson, yellow ochre, and Prussian blue for the shadowed areas. Now, of course, we'll need to adjust the values in these locations, so we'll be using a couple of neutrals to do so. The neutrals we'll be using, of course, are titanium white and then burnt umber. Now, of course, burnt umber is a warmer color. It's actually a darker version of orange, if we think about brown that way. But when we mix it with the Prussian blue, we can allow the Prussian blue to dominate, and when mixed with alizarin crimson, it's going to create more of a purpley shadow. Now, of course, we're going to need to have some warmer colors for the highlights. We'll use these colors minimally at the beginning, and then we can go back and glaze them over the top if we need to make things a little bit warmer. These two warmer hues that we're going to be using are cadmium red hue and cadmium yellow pale hue. Again, we'll be using these colors primarily on the right side of the face, which is closer to the light source. We'll begin by establishing some of the darker shadows around the eyes. Again, we're starting with the eyes since they're the focal point and working outward from there. We're also going to put more time and attention in these locations. We're using a mixture again of alizarin crimson, burnt umber, and Prussian blue initially to create these purpley undertones. We'll gradually get darker with our applications. And here again at the beginning stages, when we're first applying the paint, we'll see evident brush strokes, but we'll go back and smooth these applications in a moment using a sable brush. We'll get very dark here at the beginning, and then we'll slowly start to work some of the lighter values right on top of the darker values. As we're blocking in these colors initially, we're painting very loosely. We're not concerned with the details right now, just the overall shapes of value that we observe. It's also important to point out at this stage in the painting that we're not going for photorealism here. Of course, we want to create a representational portrait, but we'll allow our own personal style to show through. So instead of getting too obsessed with all of the details that we see, we want to make sure that we allow some expression to come through the finished portrait. So as you paint, as you work on your own drawings and paintings, allow your personal style to show through. Of course, if you're trying to learn to paint photorealistically, that's one thing, but if you're really trying to be an artist and allow your own personal voice to come through your paintings, don't fight that artistic voice or style that naturally comes through the process of creating a painting or drawing. Now we're slowly getting a little bit lighter with our values, and in the process we're also adding some more of the colors. We're bringing out some more of the colors. We're still working with that palette. You can see up here on the top portion of the forehead, I'm using a little bit more of the cadmium red and cadmium yellow pale hue to create a little bit of a warmer tonality. Now the areas of shadow may appear black, but it's actually a mixture of Prussian blue and burnt umber, and of course there's a little bit of alizarin crimson in there. And as we start to mix colors over the top of these darker areas, since it's still wet, we're going to see some mixing and transitioning that will happen, which will bring out some more of those purples that are created. As we're adding some of the lighter values, we're concentrating on creating a good relationship between our values. Of course, value is the element of art that deals with the lightness or darkness of a color, and it's perhaps the most important element of art that we use in a painting or a drawing. Value tells us about the light source, it tells us about the texture, and also the form of the subject. So as long as you get the value right in a painting or drawing, you're going to have a painting or drawing that communicates the subject. You can actually make a painting or drawing any color that you want as long as the values are close to being accurate. You're going to have a successful drawing or painting. So as you can see here, we're starting to bring a little bit more of the alizarin crimson in the mix, and some of our shadows are starting to take on that purpley undertone that we want. Our brushstrokes are rather bold and large at this point, and as we add additional layers, we can gradually refine some of the details. So many folks get obsessed with the details early on in the process and try to start with those, where we really want to start with more of a good foundation and then slowly build out the details. This naturally happens as you continue to layer more applications of the paint on the surface. We'll add a few indications of some of the wrinkles here early on. Again with our darker purple mixture using alizarin crimson, Prussian blue, and burnt umber. For the more warmer areas, even on the side of the face that's a little bit cooler, we'll use the yellow ochre primarily as our yellow. This will create a more natural looking tone, almost a lighter brown as you can see here. We'll continue to darken the shadows and increase the contrast as we go, just working on those value relationships. A few highlights are added down the bridge of the nose. We're also thinking about the directional strokes that we make with our paintbrush. We want these strokes to flow around the form of the face. So if you were to take your finger and rub it over the top of this man's face, your finger would flow in a specific direction, and your brushstroke should mimic this. This is a concept known as cross contour lines. And a lot of times when we think about cross contour lines, we think of applying them to like a pen and ink drawing. But of course, they're very relevant in any drawing or painting that you create. So when we're painting, of course, we need to think about our brush strokes flowing along with those cross contour lines. We'll add a few highlights here on the eye that's closest to the light source. Here we're using a little bit more of the warmer colors that we're using in our mixture, so a little bit more of the cadmium yellow and a touch of the cadmium red. We're also playing a little bit with color theory here as we're trying to play up a complementary relationship between the shadows and the highlights. Of course, our shadows are going to be a bit more purple, as I've mentioned a few times, and our highlights are going to be a little bit warmer and, as a result, a little bit more yellow. And of course, purple and yellow are complementary colors. So not only are we building up a bit of contrast between our values, the darks and the lights, but also a bit of contrast between our colors. So the yellow is going to stand out a little bit more against the purple, and that will create a good complementary relationship even in our skin tones. You'll also notice that quite a bit of the blue of the surface is still showing through, and that is something that we wanted right from the start. That blue will help to cool down the shadows and again convey that element of sadness in the painting. Now at this point, we're still patiently adding a variety of different versions of our skin tone, again sticking with the palette that we started with, and we're also working on those value relationships. And since we're working on a smooth gessoed panel, these brushstrokes are going to be very strong. And of course we could continue this painting and allow these brushstrokes to be very strong and evident, but in a moment we'll go back with a softer sable brush and smooth the transitions of tone and value. It's important to kind of patiently work up to that point though if you're working on the surface and you're using this particular approach to painting. We don't want to blend too early in the process. We want to make sure that we have a good value relationship and good color relationship going on before we get to that stage. That's why I'm continuing to add additional colors and additional values and versions of our mixture at this point. We'll add a little bit of warmth over here, even in the side of the face that's shadowed. This is the upper cheekbone that protrudes out a little bit more, and it's catching a little bit more of that warmer light. We'll also add an indication of a highlight on the side of the left eye that's closest to the light source. And then we'll add a few more highlights, bringing out some of the wrinkles on the right side of the face. At this point, we're still sticking with mostly the cooler versions of the colors that we're using, the alizarin crimson, the Prussian blue, and the yellow ochre. As we work through the painting, we'll start to make decisions on whether or not we need to bring out some of the warmer colors, and we will later in the process, but right now we're still sticking with some of those cooler versions of the colors. All right, now we're ready to start blending these applications. So I'm using a sable brush that is completely clean, and I'm just making brush strokes over the top of the applications that we have in place, and this is going to smooth our transitions of color. If you've ever used a blending stump with traditional graphite drawing, this is the same kind of thing. We're just blending and smoothing transitions of color and value. And we can pull some of these colors into other locations if we want using the sable brush. So in other words, we can essentially change the shape of the color or value as we go. And as you can see, it's eliminating some of the visible brush strokes that we have in place, creating more of a smoother appearance. We're still allowing our color relationships to exist and of course our contrast to exist, but we're just creating more of a smoother texture that's a little bit more believable and a little bit more representational of a person's face. Now over the top, we can continue to add additional applications of different values and more of our colors. This time you can see on the right side of the nose, which is closest to the light source, we'll add a little bit more of our warmer yellow, here a bit of cadmium yellow. And we'll do the same thing on the right side of the eye. Then we can bring in a little bit more of that cadmium red as well into the mix. A few imperfections are added with just a touch of the alizarin crimson mixed in. And we'll add a little bit more of that alizarin crimson on the bottom portion of the nose as well. We'll continue to gradually add some of those warmer tones, again increasing the contrast in not only the value but also the color relationships. And then we'll continue to bring out highlights as we go as well. Now, some of these colors may seem really strong at this point, but as we continue to add layers, they'll become a little bit more muted, but they'll still show through the additional layers that we apply over the top. So as we're looking at the reference and making decisions about what colors we add, we can recognize some of the colors that are underneath and understand that through additional layering, we can gradually affect how strong these colors are and how much of them show through. We can also notice quite a bit of contrast between the brushstrokes that we're adding at this point and the smoothed out applications that we applied earlier but went back over the top of with a sable brush. Again, these applications that we're adding right now at this point, we'll go back and smooth these applications with a sable brush in a moment, but for right now we're just concentrating on some of the stronger colors that we see. And again, recognizing that some of these colors are going to be underneath additional layers that we add on top. Now for a little bit of the shadow, as we work down from the top of the face, we're going to add a little bit more of the burnt umber in the mixture. You can see this clearly evident on the right side of the face at this point where we have burnt umber, just a touch of Prussian blue and yellow ochre. And we'll also continue to add some of those warmer highlights, again, keeping our mixture dominated by the cadmium red and also the cadmium yellow. The only point where we've used pure white at this point is in the highlight of the eye. It can be very tempting to add some of those strong highlights that you see using pure white, but usually our highlights are a lighter version of a color. The only exception might be in and around the eye, and even in our areas where we have highlights in the eyes, there's a little bit of that Prussian blue that mixes in that makes it feel a little bit more natural. Now we're ready to go back with an additional round of blending using the sable brush. And again, since we've got some of the colors added on top of our initial layer, we'll have some of those layers of colors show through this blended application. We'll work around some of the highlighted areas on the nose, allowing those to remain strong for now. And just like with using a blending stump, it's easy to get carried away with the blending. So as we're blending with the sable brush, we're making sure that we leave areas of color that need to remain strong, just like as I mentioned on the bridge of the nose. For now, we'll move on to other areas of the face and get a little bit of information in these locations. Then we can go back and make adjustments to our area of focus. Again, we're trying to ensure that we have a strong focal point in the areas of the eyes. So these are the areas that we're going to work the most, the eyes and around the eyes. Now, at the beginning, I mentioned that this is a direct painting method. And what that means is that we're applying colors and values as we see them. Now, for many of us, this is the approach that we would assume that we should take to a painting anyway. We just start adding colors and values as we see them. But this approach differs from an indirect painting method, which in an indirect painting method, you might start with a painting that's just made up of the values. So you might start up with a painting that's just made up of black and whites and the grays in between. And then over the top, you start to add the colors, either by glazing or applying thicker applications. Of course, the advantage to using an indirect painting method is that we can separate our values from our colors. So we can concentrate on developing the values early in the painting process and then turn our attention to developing the colors. With the direct painting method, we're thinking about the values and the colors essentially at the same time, which for some folks that might make things a little bit more difficult, but for others it might feel more natural. I typically go both ways. For some subjects, I like to use an indirect painting method, and for others, I like to use a more direct painting method. And in most cases, you'll find that you use a combination of both approaches. So I think the key takeaway here is there is an endless number of ways that you can create a painting. And I think it's important for us not to get too wrapped up in the actual process and allow ourselves to just be creative in the process of painting. I think if we give ourselves that freedom, what happens is we end up with a piece of art rather than just a reproduction of something that we've seen from reality. So we're adding a little bit of warmth and a few highlights to the right side of the forehead here. We've established, of course, the darker areas, again, using our mixture of Prussian blue and alizarin crimson with burnt umber. And now we're going back in and lightening up some of the values. We'll also add a little bit of a warmer shadow to the right side of the forehead to make it look like the forehead protrudes, so we'll need to have a little bit of a slight change in value on the right side of the face. And that's accomplished with a bit more burnt umber in the mix. And then again, we'll go back to our cooler shadows on the other side of the face and add a bit more of the alizarin crimson with the Prussian blue. And then once we've got our initial applications on the forehead, we'll go back with the sable brush again and smooth the transitions of tone and value and get rid of some of these evident brush strokes. And of course, as we ease these transitions from light to dark, the form of the forehead starts to make a bit more sense, and we also see a little bit more of that complexity in the color in the forehead that we've developed already in the face. Again, this is created by layering colors on top of each other. We'll continue blending with the sable brush, and as we go, we can soften up some of the hard edges that happen in the wrinkles. Now that we've got some information on the forehead, we're ready to go back to the eyes and the areas around the eyes and continue to work these sections. We'll start with the dark shadow that goes right along the side of the nose. Again, using alizarin crimson, Prussian blue, and a bit of burnt umber, we can refine the shape of this shadow. In this case, I also noticed that I need to bring the left nostril down a little bit further on the face. So using this shadow color, I can refine the shape of the nostril. We'll also add some of this darker value just underneath the nose as well. We can also pull out a few additional wrinkles on the left side. And of course, our wrinkles, or the illusion of wrinkles, is created by the contrast in value. So we'll have dark values right next to light values, and that'll give us the impression of wrinkles. And of course, we want some of these transitions to be a little bit softer, so we can go back in with the sable brush if we prefer and smooth out these transitions. We'll also increase the contrast, especially in the crease that happens right at the top of the eyelid here on the right side of the face. And again, it may be deceiving. It may look like this is actually a black, but again, it's just a mixture of our dark blue, Prussian blue, and our dark brown burnt umber. We'll go ahead and refine some of the wrinkles on this side as well. And initially, these wrinkles are going to seem very, very strong, but we'll soften them up. Now we can go back with the sable brush and soften some of these wrinkles. Of course, this is going to tone down some of the contrast, but the wrinkles will still be evident. Now, of course, it's important that you use a soft brush like a sable brush to do the blending here. You try to use a harder brush or a coarser brush like a hog bristle brush to do the blending. You'll do some blending, but the texture of the brush is so stiff and strong, especially on a smooth surface like this, that you'll introduce additional brush strokes. So if you're looking for that soft transition of tone and value, it's highly recommended to use a soft sable brush to do your blending. Now we're going back in and adding some of those warmer tones along the wrinkles in the forehead. And of course, as we add lighter values, it'll make the wrinkles stand out a little bit more and increase the impression of the light source originating from the upper right-hand corner. It also brings a little bit more life to the painting. At this point, a lot of our colors are a little bit grayish, and we kind of want that in the painting. Of course, some of the blue undertones are still showing through, and we can see that clearly in the painting. And of course, we want that to happen in the end result. We want those blue undertones to show through. Again, it's going to create a little bit more of a natural appearance, but it's also going to keep our painting muted and will hopefully evoke that feeling of sadness. But nonetheless, we still need some warmer tones, and so we'll continue to add them here primarily on the right side of the face. Again, we're creating our warmer skin tones by adding more of the cadmium red and more of the cadmium yellow pale hue to our mixture. And as you can see here, we'll continue to adjust highlights as we go, again incorporating a good contrast between our values. And with each layered application, we'll just revisit these sections with the softer sable brush, again blending and smoothing and creating a more representational texture. Now that we have some colors and values in place around the eyes, we can go back and start adding additional details and again bump up that contrast between values. Here I'm going back in with titanium white with just a slight bit of the cadmium yellow pale hue mixed in, and I'm adding a few additional highlights. We'll also pull some of that warmth out to the upper cheekbone. And you can see we're just gradually bringing additional warmth to the right side of the face. Now we'll pull out some of the wrinkles. We'll add a few of those highlights in between some of the darker lines. And here's a closer look at some of those warmer colors that are being applied to the right side of the face. Using our warmer mixture, we can now add a strong highlight to the right eyelid. You can see here we're using the softer sable brush to make these applications. To ensure that we have a fluid stroke, a bit more of our medium is mixed with the paint before making these applications. For this painting, I'm using Winsor & Newton's Oil Color Artist Painting Medium. We'll apply a slightly lighter value up the top portion of the bridge of the nose, and then quickly blend that application using the brush. Then we'll continue to add some hints of lighter value and also increase the contrast by making the shadow a bit darker on the left side. Here again, we can smooth and blend these applications using the sable brush as we go. Now again, it's back to the top portion of the forehead, again increasing the contrast, adding just a few hints of additional highlights. And since we're going back and forth between our subject and our painting, we'll notice additional details that need to be added. In this case, I'm bringing the wrinkle up the bridge of the nose up a little bit higher and adding additional wrinkles underneath the right eye. We'll make these wrinkles stand out a bit more by adding some lighter values around them, and then we'll work on the transition down the right side of the face. At this point, I think we have enough information around the eyes and we're ready to add the eyebrows. So we'll start with a dark application. This is a mixture of burnt umber and Prussian blue, but as you can see, it's dominated by the burnt umber, so it'll be quite a bit warmer. We can use the sable brush to pull some of the wet paint into the surrounding skin, giving the impression of a few stray hairs. We'll do the same for the left eyebrow. And then we can make adjustments to the shape using the sable brush. Now we'll add a few highlights using a mixture of titanium white with a touch of cadmium yellow pale hue. There's also just a touch of burnt umber in this mixture as well to tone it down a bit. We'll make strokes in the direction that the hair grows. And we'll also add a few additional stray hairs. We can then increase the contrast and add just a bit of shadow. After softening the shape of the eyebrow on the left side of the face, we can do the same thing, adding a few indications of some of the hairs. We'll start with our light applications. These seem incredibly strong when we first apply them, but then we can go back and soften them up a bit. We'll also add a few stray hairs here as well. Now we'll turn our attention to developing the ears. We'll start with a dark purple. Again, this dark purple is mixed by using alizarin crimson with Prussian blue and burnt umber. After defining the overall shape, we can go in and start pulling out some of the lighter values that exist down towards the bottom of the ear. We'll gradually get slightly lighter, working the applications in by blending. We'll add a bit more of the alizarin crimson to make the color a little bit warmer. Then we can blend these applications again using our soft sable brush. Our right ear is on the side of the face that's closest to the light source, so we'll start with warmer colors here, using our mixture of cadmium red, cadmium yellow, a bit of yellow ochre, titanium white, and then burnt umber to mute the color. After establishing the shape, we'll start pushing some of the darker values. We'll add a bit of alizarin crimson in the areas of shadow. We'll gradually work the colors and values until they match the side of the face that we've already developed. We'll add a few warmer highlights. And then using our sable brush, we can blend these applications. We don't want there to be too many details in the area of the ear because we don't want to take away focus from the eyes. For now, we'll move on to the lips and the beard. We'll start here by establishing the darker tones. We'll start with our darker and cooler mixture of alizarin crimson, Prussian blue, and burnt umber. If needed, we can add a bit more of the alizarin crimson to the mix to make it match the shadows on the left side of the face. Now we can gradually get lighter. Here we'll use some of our warmer colors to accentuate some of the highlights on the lips. Just as we've done throughout the painting, we'll start with looser applications, and as we layer more applications of paint over the top, we'll allow our details to slowly emerge. And just as we've done on the bulk of the head, we'll make sure that our shadows are a bit cooler, primarily on the left side of the lips, and we'll allow our colors to be a little bit warmer on the right side of the lips, especially in the areas of highlight. We'll put down a bit more of our darker shadow color and bring it down past the lips so that we have a bit more value to make comparisons. Then we'll return to the lips and continue to work our value relationships. We'll add a bit more warmth on the right side of the lips with a bit more of the yellow ochre. And just slightly above the right side of the lips. We'll do a bit of blending to our shadowed area, and then it's time to add some of the strongest highlights in the area of the lips. We want the details of the lips to be suggested rather than spelled out completely. We'll continue to work on our value and color relationships, this time adding additional amounts of warmth to the right side of the bottom lip. And then we'll darken up the shadow. In this case, the shadow is the darkest right underneath the nose, making its way down to the middle of the lips. And then of course, it's much darker where the upper lip meets the bottom lip. The sable brush is then used to soften these applications. And then we'll go ahead and fill in the shape of the beard. We'll start with a darker value here, even though the majority of the beard is lighter in value on the right side. We'll bring our darker purple mixture all the way across, defining the overall shape of the beard. We'll go ahead and bring this color and value up into the shape of the hair as well, filling in the shape completely. We can allow our mixture to be dominated by the burnt umber when we get closer to the warmer side of the head, closest to the light source. We'll darken up some of the values on the left side of the beard. And we'll add some hints of darker value on the right side as well. We'll do the same to the hair before softening the entire application with a sable brush. This gets rid of most of the brush strokes and gives us a nice flat surface to add details, which we'll do later in the process. For now, we'll go ahead and establish the colors of the clothing. We'll start with a mixture of Prussian blue and burnt umber. This mixture is dominated by the Prussian blue. We'll add a lighter but muted version of this color on the right side of the body. We'll continue adding blues, allowing there to be a transition between the darker blues on the left side of the body and the lighter blues on the right side of the body. We'll also bring these applications up into the beard. We'll overlap them in a minute when we start addressing some of the details of the beard. We'll continue adding blues using looser brush strokes. Again, we're not going to develop too much detail in these sections, but we do want to make sure that our color harmonizes with the rest of the colors in the piece. We will use a sable brush to smooth transitions, however. Now we'll address some of the colors of the background, and for this painting I'm going to keep the colors relatively the same. So we'll use a mixture of Prussian blue and titanium white. We'll allow the Prussian blue to be a bit more dominant in this mixture closer to the top of the composition. Then using a mixture of burnt umber, yellow ochre, and mostly titanium white, we'll start developing some of the brush strokes that will eventually create the illusion of the hair and the beard. We'll go right on top of the darker applications that we have in place. And since these dark applications are still wet, some of it will mix with the applications that we make, creating a more natural appearance. Of course, we'll want to pull brush strokes in the direction that the hair grows. So these brush strokes will come out from the face and taper. But of course, we don't want to paint every single strand of hair. Instead, we should think of the beard as being a volume made up of smaller strands of hair. So although we're building up some of the texture initially with our brushstrokes, we're going to gradually build up the contrast to create the impression of an overall form, and we'll allow these brushstrokes to give us the impression of texture that we're after, rather than spelling out every single detail. We're adding a bit of warmth here with a bit of yellow ochre as well, primarily on the side of the beard that's closest to the light source. Now, using the softer sable brush, we can go in and start blending these applications. And as we do, some of the textural marks that we created with our initial brushstrokes will remain, but we can soften up some of the other ones and again concentrate on that volume. We'll pull out some of the darker hairs down the side of the face, connecting with the beard, and we'll also add a few additional highlights to the beard to make it stand out a bit more. These highlights are warmed up with a touch of red. Now we'll add a few of the highlights to the hair. Again, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time developing all of the individual details that we see in the hair. Again, not to take focus away from the eyes and the center portion of the face. For our lighter highlights, we'll mix a bit more of the yellow ochre with our titanium white and a touch of burnt umber. We'll also develop the shadowed areas by using a mixture of burnt umber and Prussian blue. Of course, heavily dominated by the burnt umber to give it a bit of warmth. We can add strong highlights initially and then go back with the sable brush and blend the applications. Just as we did with the beard, we want to be conscious of the direction that the hair is growing, so our brush strokes should taper as we pull them out. We'll add additional contrast to the beard at this point, adding some darker shadows, and then we'll continue working back and forth between the hair and the beard, creating highlights and shadows so that we create ample contrast in a full range of value. Now that we've established our background colors, values, and also many of the values and colors of the hair and the beard, we can start to reevaluate the colors and color temperature of the face. In this case, I see that things need to be warmed up quite a bit. So I'll apply a glaze using a bit of cadmium yellow pale hue mixed with quite a bit of our medium, right over the top of our skin tones. This light glaze is applied primarily on the side of the face that's closest to the light source. Immediately, you can see that it brings out the purple shadows and creates additional color contrast. Then we can add a few lighter and warmer highlights over the top, again using our skin mixture that's dominated by cadmium red and cadmium yellow. We'll now go to the left side of the body, which is primarily in shadow, and apply an additional application of our dark blue mixture, again Prussian blue with burnt umber, dominated by the Prussian blue. This will create a more even and solid application. It will also increase the contrast of the left side of the face. We'll add a bit of alizarin crimson to the inside portion of the right ear and bring a little bit more of those purple shadows into the face. We can adjust some of the edges around the face. In this case, I'm pulling some of the skin tones into the hair to create a softer transition of the hairline in this location. Now we're ready to add our final glaze, and for this we're going to use a bit of cadmium red, again with our medium. This translucent red glaze is applied to portions of the face to bring out a little bit more warmth. It also helps to neutralize some of those stronger yellows that we applied with our last glaze. It covers up some of the cooler blue undertones that are showing through, although we still have some of those cooler undertones so that we can still retain that feeling of sadness in the portrait. And now our oil portrait using a direct painting approach is complete. If you enjoyed this video, then I know that you'll enjoy being a member at thevirtualinstructor.com. Our comprehensive membership program includes video courses on drawing and painting, weekly live lessons, ebooks, lesson plans for teachers, weekly critiques, and much, much more. To learn more about our program, just visit thevirtualinstructor.com/members or click on the card in the upper right-hand corner. And if you want to check out 3 of our course modules for free, you can do so. Just click on the link on your screen now. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure that you subscribe to the channel. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.